First of all, I am a interloper. I've just literally been parachuted in because the CEO of ANA and the CEO of DTIF are apparently stuck somewhere trying to get to Davos. So let's wish them well. They will eventually get to Davos, but they have missed their panel. It's fine. We will cover it. Alex will cover it for them. But why don't we start with a round of introductions? Alex, we'll just start with you because you're right here, and then we'll go down the line.
Sure. So, hi everybody. My name is Alexandre Kech. I'm the CEO of the Global LEI Foundation. LEI stands for Legal Entity Identification. It's a non-for-profit, multi-country system to identify legal entities, as it says in the name, created by regulators and still overseen today by 70 regulators from all over the planet.
Great. Hi, I'm Gail Hodges. I'm the Executive Director of the OpenID Foundation. And the OpenID Foundation is a technical open standards body, and we specialize in standards for login, single sign-on, open finance, open banking, and other forms of data sharing, digital identity, and sharing signals.
And I'm Daniela Barbosa. I'm the General Manager at the Linux Foundation for Decentralized Technologies. The Linux Foundation for the last 20 plus years has been the home for some of the most important open source projects, obviously the Linux kernel and our namesake. But since 2015, we've also have projects addressing blockchain and digital identity. In addition to serving as General Manager for decentralized technologies across projects like Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust, which used to be, was expanded from Hyperledger Foundation and Trust over IP. We also have a foundation very focused on digital wallets with the Open Wallet Foundation and the Decentralized Identity Foundation. So when you think about the Linux Foundation, it's an umbrella of multiple both open source code projects and standards and specifications as well. And I oversee as general manager many of these projects. Many of them have their own project communities and their executive directors as well. And it's a great honor, and I want to thank Sandra and the rest of the GBVC team for including us once again in Davos. I think we've been here since the start, and it's just a fantastic topic because as digital assets get adoption and really into production worldwide, standards and code need to be working together, so I'm very excited about participating today.
So I think generally speaking, all of us here, and by the way, we love standards, and we absolutely believe that standards are what we need in order to scale to get to that next level. And digital assets are pretty much there, getting there. One thing that I think we do need to unpack a bit is that there are different levels of standards. So what I would call regulatory standards, there are industry-led standards or business standards, as well as technical standards. And I would love if Gail, we'll start with you on digital identity, because people talk about digital identity so much, as in people identity. How does OpenID Foundation, what sorts of things do you focus on? And then who do you benefit, by the way?
So the OpenID Foundation started as, on the industry side, if you will, focused on large digital platforms, figuring out, oh, we have a shared problem with individuals needing to kind of log in with us as a Google or an Apple or a AWS, and we need to help them get access to something else, right? We want to create a consumer login, like login with Microsoft, login with Google, and then over time that also became cloud-based services, so an AWS or a Google Cloud getting access for single sign-on enterprise use cases. So that kind of crystallized around 2012 and is now scaled to millions of applications with billions of users. And to begin with, it was really industry-led. And over time, we've become, the same kind of core standards have been extended to different types of use cases, including like open banking and open data, which have much more government leadership in those use cases. And many governments have adopted the OpenID Connect standard for sharing of health records or sharing of insurance-related information. So there's many applications that the standards have been used for, and as that's matured, it's crossed into these other domain spaces, working in conjunction with NIST, NIST kind of recognizing our standards, or CISA recognizing our standards, and sometimes they're written into the law or the regulation that thou shalt use OpenID Connect, thou shalt use FAPI, and sometimes it's just a baseline requirement, and then they meet that requirement by using the global open standards that we offer. But it's important as a yes, private sector-led standards body with that government engagement, that we're following the World Trade Organization's best practices for standards development. And so it offers that transparency, that inclusive approach. There's no paywalls for people to participate and develop and contribute to the standards. Everything is freely available. There's no cost to use it. And that approach, it resonates both with private sector implementers from the lowest, smallest organizations to the largest corporates, as well as for the government players who want to know that they're going to select standards that are going to have viability and that will meet their needs over time.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. And Alex, I've heard you speak now several times about, in different venues, around LEI, so I would love for you to unpack LEI for us. But I think one of the misnomers that people have are related to digital identity. They think of people, and they automatically just go to people. But actually, there are objects, there are organizational identities that need to be taken into account. So if you could talk a little bit about LEI, and then obviously you've got VLEI, would love to hear.
Sure. So typically, an organization is incorporated at national level. So when they incorporate at the business registry, they're receiving a national identity card, if you wish. So it's a business registry identity that they use for sometimes tax reporting, sometimes just onboarding, just identifying themselves, like you would have your identity card. Those systems work very well nationally, but they don't work cross-border. They would not be recognized by other countries the same way that if I have my Belgium ID card and I try to go to South Korea, they won't let me in. I need a passport. And that's really what the legal entity identifier is. It was created at the back of the financial crisis with that realization by regulators, but also by the banking industry initially, that they had no idea who they were dealing with, or if they would, it would be very fragmented because the identification system they were using were siloed at national level. So they decided to create this global system for identification of identification entities that does not replace national system, but complement it with a cross-border component. So that's for the historical reason why the LEI exists. Today, it's issued to millions of companies around the world, not only in the financial industry, but also in the corporates, for example, who are using that identifiers to do regulatory reporting, to do KYB for banks, to identify themselves in financial transaction, and more also in supply chain, in ESG reporting, and all other use cases where you need to identify entities. Now that's good. You have an identifier for entities, you have identifiers for individuals, but how do you link them together? And that's where the concept of VLEI came about, is verifiable legal entity identifier. It's the ability for a company to digitally and verifiably identify themselves on digital platform, be it Web 2 or Web 3, but also the people acting on behalf of that company to be cryptographically linked to that company. So companies don't take decision, people in companies takes decisions, sign contracts, etc., act on behalf of the company. So on digital platform, it's important to have that link, cryptographical link, between the CEO of the company, his role, and the company. An employee of the company is allowed to sign transaction over $1 million, for example, and ensure that when they do that on digital platform, they're not impersonating the company or impersonating someone of the company in the process. So that's, in a nutshell, what the LEI and the VLEI is. The VLEI is kind of bringing the LEI and more onto the digital world, and leveraging a protocol that we want to be as interoperable as possible with other existing protocol, because at the end of the day, we care about the users of the protocol, not about our own little techie things. We just want to make sure it's used and it's efficient for the purpose it's being used for.
And we'll come back to a bit more about how adoption is going and sort of the roadmap. But I want to go over to Daniela. You and I have known each other for a very long time, and we're big fans of what Linux Foundation is doing across myriad of different standards and work. I was wondering if you could delve a bit into what you are working on specifically related to some of the blockchain related topics that you can talk about publicly.
Sure. So one of the projects is Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust. Many of you have known about the Hyperledger Foundation, which is where most of the open source blockchain frameworks that are used across the banking industry, across healthcare, across supply chain and traceability. So we're talking about projects like Hyperledger Fabric, Bezu, which is the EVM client, and even our most recent project, which is called Hyro, which is the Hedera, entirety of the Hedera code base. So really, really a big swath of projects, both in the permission blockchain space as well as in the public blockchain space as well. And this is just the evolution of the market and how things are moving. And we've been very happy, from the start to say there wasn't going to be one blockchain to rule them all. There's also, if you think about digital credentials and verifiable credentials, for example, there are implementations that are very well done and meet the purpose of the market and the use cases thereafter that do not use blockchain, right? And one of the things that very early on our community started working on is making sure that the optionality of using for example, verifiable credentials when you're talking about those are not tied into you have to use it on the blockchain. And this, once again, and Sandra, you've been at this just alongside with me, is the changing mindset of adoptions of these technologies, and more, and the GBBC has been doing a wonderful job at educating the market of understanding the tech and then making the tech decisions based on the business outcomes and really the regulations, for example, that people want. So we're very excited, for us, when we think about the code, the standard code technology requirements, right? The EVM, for example, with Bezu, right, is the most adopted EVM on the permission side, also runs 16%, last I checked, of the Ethereum mainnet. And those are standards that in the banking industry, for example, they can look and they can say, at Linux Foundation, we know that Bezu is becoming a standard, or is a standard mostly adopted. It is also openly governed, right, and openly developed. There is no vendor locked in, right? There's a vendor diversity that people have, and that's really important.
And that's a critical point about everything you do. It is about open source. And I mean, it's literally the foundation of Linux Foundation. But also, does everyone know that Hedera, literally, open source their code? When did that happen? Last year?
That happened in September, and it's the first public blockchain that donated their entire code base to a public, to a neutral foundation, which is the Linux Foundation under LF Decentralized Trust. And I think, and we've been talking to many layer ones over the years, when you look at open source and open development and open governance, right? Open source, we love it. Put your code out on GitHub, make sure everybody can use it, make sure everybody can talk about it, make sure everyone could add their notes and their comments. Open governance and open development is really critical when you're building financial infrastructure. Just before we were talking about regulations in Brazil, for example, the DREX, the Brazilian digital CBDC is built on Bezu. One of the key things, and the central bank went out very early and they said, we selected Bezu because it's not just open source, it's openly developed and openly governed. And it sets the standards of how these things are adopted worldwide.
Appreciate that. Alex, just going back to you for a moment. LEI's been around for a while. GLEIF has been around for a while. Where is adoption right now? Where do you see you hitting that sort of tipping point of really that cross-border sweet spot?
It started initially with capital markets, OTC derivative, to be specific, after the financial crisis that we know it was mostly due to lack of transparency in that space. It has evolved into the entire capital markets in specific regions. For example, in Europe, there's a famous say, no LEI, no trade, so that's very clear from the regulators. You have to have an LEI to trade any assets, really, in Europe. And it slowly but surely expanded on the capital market space outside of Europe, outside of the US to the east, Asia Pacific, for example, with China adopting, India, Japan, Australia, Singapore, Thailand, South Korea, etc., etc. So it's really becoming a broadly accepted standard for capital markets across the world. Now it's moving into the cross-border space, cross-border payment space, with actually the G20 and the Financial Stability Board, which were at the origin of the GLEIF, actually, pushing for the adoption of LEI for identification of payer and payee into cross-border payments. There are a lot of fraud into invoice fraud, for example, and challenges with cross-border payments in terms of identifying who am I really paying. And they believe, and they rightly believe, that having an identifier is way easier to deal with than having to try to match a name and address with a company supposedly having to receive payments. You would believe that it's an easy process, and actually it's not. Strangely.
Is invoice fraud on the rise? Is that really that big of a problem?
It is a major problem, and not only for individuals like you getting an SMS asking you to pay Netflix, although you already paid Netflix, if you see what I mean. But it's also corporate fraud, and it's in the millions. Recently, there was a case of a CFO paying the wrong company, meaning the wrong accounts, 25 million. So it's not
that is a big
small
oops.
amount.
Yeah.
Exactly, it's a big hoops. So LEI and VLEI in the future are there to exactly do that. It's to ensure that you know you're talking to, and you know actually who owns who as well, because you have some a level of information about ownership, and that you know your risk, you know your by certainty who you're dealing with, and that you secure your transaction with those people. Now, in moving to the blockchain world, because this is a blockchain conference, digital assets specifically, there is a big interest. Well, I've always said in panels that organizational identity is the missing puzzle piece for institutional adoption of blockchain, because it's the flip coin of a digital asset. A digital asset belongs to someone, or a company, is serviced by a company. So being able to leverage the LEI and the VLEI to clearly identify what company is the issuer of that token, to clearly identify who is behind that wallet, or at least when you need to be transparent about that, to who has issued that smart contract service that you can swap tokens over. Is that a real company, or is it someone pretending to be that company? Who has audited that smart contract? So all this can be dealt with the LEI and the VLEI in a verifiable way, and therefore bringing trust again back into the ecosystem, with a system that is, and I'll finish there, interoperable with traditional finance, which is important.
That crossover, yes.
Exactly, very important.
The bridge, yes, absolutely. Gail, everyone is, I actually think a lot of people in this space are probably obsessed about, we need digital identity and how that fits with blockchain. What are some of the impediments that you're seeing for there to be really, truly universal digital identity solutions? There are a bunch out there. It's not that they're not solutions out there, but what is the problem? Do we just need to get our...
I'll get into the impediments, but if I may, I'll build off of what Alex was just talking about, because he was saying one of the major blockers is people not appreciating the value of the LEI and that identifier, to enable the cross-border transactions. It's also the same on the consumer side. Right? If there's an end consumer taking part in a blockchain-related transaction, how do you know for sure who that consumer is? There's both the KYC on the initial setup of the account, but then there's also at that moment in that time, a transaction being conducted. Is it still the same person? Do you have that high level of confidence? So you need both pieces, right? What we're both offering. Okay. I should say from the community as a whole. On the consumer side, there's even more competition on the consumer side for digital identity infrastructure than there is on the entity side. So that's one piece of the puzzle. We have to have both, right? In order to unlock the growth of the crypto markets, unlock the growth of the blockchain piece. It's also true for traditional finance, traditional transactions. You need that core digital identity infrastructure as well. In terms of impediments, back to your question, there is many impediments, and it depends on the jurisdiction that you're in, right? So I think if you're in India, the ship has already sailed, right? There's 1.3 billion individuals with digital identity credentials. In Singapore, fantastic penetration. In Estonia, fantastic penetration. There's on the order of about 1.4 billion digital identity credentials issued today. One of the up and coming is Brazil. They've done a fantastic job with rolling out their digital identity infrastructure and integrating it into their government services and their everyday work. But that's not commonly understood if you're in a European market or you're in a US market, because it's not part of your daily life yet. Those of us that are a bit more informed are well aware that the European community will have access to a digital wallet come 2026, and most of these jurisdictions are working ferociously to build their own wallets against the EU digital wallet criteria, the architectural reference framework, which happens to use OpenID Foundation standards among several others. Other jurisdictions in the US, some of you might have heard of ID and Wallet from Apple or Google Wallet having identity credentials, and quite recently passports also being available with Google Wallet. Those are using the ISO standard 18013-5, moving towards -7 for online presentation. And that's great for the 10 plus markets that are currently live, primarily with a use case for travel, but that's expanding into other use cases we could talk about. But we're seeing that movement in the US. It is good that it's red and blue states together, so it's not just leaning one way or the other. And we will expect that another 10, 20 of those states will continue to come out. But it's still not really part of the zeitgeist, right? It's not really part of the way that people are thinking. So the blockers are global awareness, that it even exists, certainly even here around
So we
the
can
World
do
Economic
something
Forum.
about that. We need
Indeed.
to raise the awareness.
Absolutely.
All right,
Absolutely.
that's one. Check.
Okay, keep going. So there's one is certainly the global awareness, right? The core role that digital identity infrastructure can play. Second is the investment, right? So looking at all of these different jurisdictions, regardless of whether it's public sector led or private sector led, every jurisdiction needs to have that core capability. And then third, of course, is adoption. You can see how in a place like India or Brazil, it becomes part of everyday transactions. Then you need to have the adoption path for individual jurisdictions to take advantage. And then what we see is that interoperability cross-border to unleash global trade, to unleash the power of both people and businesses to cross borders.
Well, I think everyone in this room has a role to play. One, in not only in the awareness piece, but really, do you see the investment piece about it coming from governments, or is it really going to be led by industry or private sector?
Personally, I see absolutely both.
Okay.
100%, it's both.
Alex?
Absolutely. It has to be both, because identity is not a private sector thing. It's not only a public sector thing. It's concerning private individuals, private companies, and often based as a root of trust based on government issuance of identification, at least for individuals and also for companies. So it needs to be both, and it's important that it's both in collaboration.
Yeah, I agree. And it also has to be down at the code level, have governments contribute. So for example, the government of British Columbia have been one of the most, active maintainers to some of the code bases under LF Decentralized Trust. And why? Because they're building it into critical digital identity trust infrastructure into their systems. So looking at countries like Canada and the government of British Columbia, there's examples in Estonia, there's examples in Bhutan now, like those things, because they're building it critically, and they have the requirement to bring not just the funding to fund the private sector to build it, but then the funding to put in developer resources into the community build it for them as well, which is really, really important. I don't think we've seen that across many technology enhancements over the years.
Well, the other key piece that people tend to forget is once you've created these standards, they need to be maintained and updated every so often. So is it a nonprofit that really should be doing that, a more neutral body? I would imagine that the answer is yes there.
Yes.
Fantastic.
I think it's important to say that identity, and I always say that, is a protocol play. It can't be a platform play. It can't be a commercial play. It's really about, it needs to be a public good, as it is today. Nobody is asking you to pay millions and millions to just have an identity. It's important that it is a non-for-profit public good.
Fantastic.
If I can chime in, the analogy that I like to give is that you would expect your digital identity to be as easy to express as sending an email or making a telephone call or presenting a passport. But it barely exists today. But that's kind of like where we would have to get to, is that complete interoperability, that complete ability, whether you're in a country or across countries, to be able to extend it. So trying to get to that end game, we as a community of nonprofit leaders, we're also not as mature and as aligned and as fit for purpose as we will need to be over time.
Okay.
But that core point that we just talked about, that there has to be both government engagement and private sector engagement, is going to be part of where we need to get to. And historically, historically, you see internet is more private sector led, and you see certain areas like the LEI has had more government, oversight and regulation. We need to work out for ourselves, where do we need to land for digital identity oversight and governance? I have a hypothesis it needs to be somewhere in the middle. It can't be all private and all public, but it depends on a particular government or a lens you look at the problem. If you look at it from financial services, you say, oh, it's government oversight. If you look at it from digital public infrastructure, you'd say, oh, it has to be government oversight.
Right.
If you look at it from independence of the internet and movement of data
Yep.
and private companies and digital innovation, you might say, or AI, you might say it has to be private sector led.
Wow, it's almost as if we teed it up for the next entire 3 hours we're going to be spending with the Decentralized AI Society on that very topic. I do want to say, I feel like we need to take this conversation and continue it into 2025. And every single one of you now has some homework to do, which is to raise awareness around how important it is for us to find standards at a global level for identity, whether it's people or it's organizational, legal entities. This is something we really need to knit together for the benefit of crypto, digital assets, and blockchain. All right. Well, thank you very much to my awesome panelists.
Thank you, Sandra.